Hello, everyone. I am delighted to join you today as part of Natalie's All Things 16th Century Women. It is definitely an honor to be here today and to get to speak with you about someone you may not know very well. But I hope after learning more about her that you will be as delighted to have met her and made her acquaintance as I have been, and as excited to get to know someone who, although not part of what we traditionally maybe think of when we think of the Tudor era and Tudor England, has some really fascinating connections with some of those Tudor women we know and love so much. So I'm delighted to introduce you today to Hurrem Sultan. She does have several different names, although interestingly, we're not really sure what her birth name was. But she is also called Roxelana, and it is by that name that I'll be primarily referring to her today. So, as we get ready to meet Roxelana and hear her story, I do have just a few images I want to share with you. You might be a little surprised that my first image is the field of cloth of gold, possibly one of the epic images that really epitomizes the reign of Henry VIII, the heart of the Tudors, that desire to show off the wealth and power and magnificence of the Tudor dynasty. And of course, we know that Francois le Premier, Francis I of France, was also there showing off the wealth and power and magnificence of France. And in fact, in addition to each other and England and France being the audience for all of this political posturing, they were also showing off to an extended audience, certainly Spain and the Habsburg Empire, possibly the Pope, but even beyond. Because in 1520, the Ottoman Empire was making some very interesting decisions and expansion moves. And both Henry and Francis and the other Western European leaders knew that showing off their strength and power was important for the Ottoman audience as well. After all, even though the field of cloth of gold didn't really succeed in garnering a lasting peace between England and France, as it was purported to do, it did succeed in being an opportunity to turn peace into a performance. After all, in these days, war was certainly a performance, and the field of the cloth of gold enabled Francis and Henry to show off that their peaceful posturing could be just as powerful. And this was really important to them. So they had the chivalry and the elegance and the power associated with themselves, with each other, and with Western Europe. So let's take a quick look at what's going on with the Ottoman Empire. And I want to share another image with you. And it will be an opportunity to see how things are changing in the Ottoman Empire. So between 1451 on the left and 1566, yes, beyond 1520, but you can see what's happening as you see the green expanding. This is an empire that is expanding over this period of time. And it has come to control since its early days in the 1300s, when it was also known as the Turkish Empire. It has come to control a great deal of Southeast Europe, Western Asia, and Northern Africa. And it was a period of growth and expansion. In the 15th century, there were some defeats for the Ottomans, and they had to pull back a little bit, but they overcame those defeats. They were able to regain lost territory. And once they conquered Constantinople in 1453, they were committed to ongoing expansion. And they began to control many of the overland trade routes between Europe and Asia. And this gave them a great deal of power and a great deal of economic power. You know, people who control the trade routes have the wealth and control the wealth and control the access. And so the empire was flourishing during this time. So you can see part of the reason that Western European monarchs like Henry VIII, like Francis I, would be interested in showing off on a really grand scale, not something that would only be known by each other. But the field of cloth of gold was certainly covered around the world, and the Ottomans knew about it. And it was very important for Western European leaders that the Ottomans knew about what was happening. So I want to take a look at one of the most well-known Ottoman leaders and get a chance to know this empire just a little bit more through him. And that is Suleiman the Magnificent. So if you're looking for nicknames, I think the Magnificent, pretty good one. He succeeded his father, Selim, who had expanded the empire considerably to the south and to the east. And Selim, the father of Suleiman, had established Ottoman rule in Egypt. And so this was a time of success. And when Suleiman succeeded his father, he wanted to carry on that history and that tradition of expansion. But he was also smart enough to know that in his campaigns against some of these Christian leaders, he only could go as far as he could control the expansion. In other words, it was not sort of out of control, let's get all the land we can and then worry later about how to control it. He was very determined to conquer and control in a measured and strategic way. Interestingly, he was also a big patron of the arts. So he was more than a military man. He oversaw what is referred to as the golden age of the Ottoman Empire in terms of visual arts, literature, music, architecture. He was dedicated and devoted to expending money to enhance his nation in these ways as well. So this was a ruler who really wanted to make a mark, certainly on a military and territorial way, but also in the arts. He was a very well-rounded, we might call him a Renaissance man, but he was very well-rounded. But with all of this, with the expansion, with him setting up and pushing ahead into the expansion into Africa, with all that he was able to achieve in the arts, the thing he's honestly the most well known for is breaking years of tradition and just causing a huge upheaval in the societal structure that had kept everything together in terms of power bases and how power was shared, how power was expressed, how power was practiced throughout this empire, and especially at the heart of the court. He upended all of that by having a favorite concubine and marrying her. And taking those steps changed everything. So let's meet this woman who changes everything. So in Suleiman's reign, it is Roxelana, also called Hurrem Sultan. You'll see here the title La Sultana Rosa. This woman challenged and changed the expectations of the role of women, and especially women who lived in the Sultan's harem. She upended everything. She refused to just play her role and be content. And it reverberated throughout the empire. Her decisions and her behaviors just reverberated. She refused. She was someone who refused to be limited by her position and by expectations that others had about how women should behave. So let's talk just a little bit about her. Her birth date and her birth name are unknown, um, but her life came to represent what is referred to as the Sultanate of Women, a time of women exerting more political influence throughout the empire. She was the beginning of women having influence throughout the Ottoman Empire. So even though she had a very humble beginning, we don't even know the details of, boy, her influence lasted. She was known as Hurrem in her lifetime, and that was a nickname given to her that meant joyful or cheerful or laughing. And so it is reasonable to take from that, if that's her nickname, that she was someone who was known that way, who was joyful or cheerful, who, made the most of difficult times, which she did. Of course, whenever a woman causes disruption, it was very true in the 16th century. I'm not sure it's not so true today, but we definitely know in the 16th century, when women cause disruption, there's all kinds of negative response to that. And she was accused of being manipulative and ambitious, that terrible word for a woman, and accused of using sorcery to manipulate the Sultan in his affections. And what often gets, when you see women have a bit of power in this time, they're often accused of all kinds of things. But I'd like for us to get to know her beyond some of the reputation that evolved around her and see what she was really like. So let's take just a moment and look at her younger years. We don't know a lot about her. This is a monument to her um, in Ukraine. So we know that she was born into a Christian family, and it was most likely in an area that is now Ukraine. And she was abducted, as were numerous people at that time, and brought over several miles to be a slave in the Ottoman Empire. And the most plausible place for her birth is the Ukraine, which was at that time under the rule of Poland. We don't know the exact location, but from other histories about her and things that she wrote about her early life, we know that many young women were abducted from that part of the world and were brought to the Ottoman Empire to serve in different capacities, to serve as slaves, and some of the lucky ones were selected to serve in the harem. So there was a large raid we know about in 1516, and Hurrem or Roxelana may have been part of that raid. We don't know for sure, but we know that raid happened. And so she may have been part of that raid and abducted during that period of time. She would have been immediately immersed in the culture of the empire, taught a new religion, expected to learn to speak Turkish, and to really turn away from anything from her childhood that she might remember and become a new identity, a new person, this new almost object as a slave. So by the time she came along, the sultans had developed a tradition of using concubines to be the parents of the royal princes and princesses. This enabled the Sultan to have a series of women who could bear him a number of different children without being tied down, to any kind of commitment to them. They were, after all, only concubines, but their children were considered legitimate heirs. And this would have been a better life than being a slave in some ways, if you could please the Sultan. And so whatever qualities Roxelana, or Hurrem as she was called, demonstrated, maybe a facility with the language, maybe an ability to charm people. Maybe this is where that idea of being cheerful and laughing and joyful worked in her favor, because this is when she got the nickname. But for whatever reason, she was chosen from among the different women to leave the sort of common servitude and enter the harem. And once a young woman was brought into the harem, they then had the opportunity to try to catch the eye of the Sultan and be selected by him. So you could just remain for a long time unnoticed in the harem. But what you really wanted to do, your way of making a life for yourself, was to catch the eye of the Sultan and bear the Sultan a child. And that was, if you were a woman in the harem, that was your way of getting ahead. So Roxelana now has this opportunity to try to get ahead. Here's, I think, one of my favorite images of her. And of course, it's from a later time, but I do think it's quite lovely. It's thought that she becomes Suleiman's concubine around 1520. This is soon after he takes control. He comes into power. Again, 1520, field of the cloth of gold. So it's almost as if Henry VIII and Francis I want to show to the new Sultan that they know what they're doing over there. But it's around this time, according to the Venetian ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman was already known in his youth from being a real lover of women and very lustful. So when he came to power, the harem was just crackling with energy because it was both about personal pleasure on his part. But now that he is Suleiman, and now that he is the Sultan, and now that he is the leader, he also needs to start producing children. He has had some children before he meets Roxelana, but now that he's the Sultan, he needs to really be producing children. This would be the way, of course, of continuing the dynasty. The sons would continue the dynasty. It was not automatic that the oldest son would continue the dynasty. The goal was to have a whole bunch of sons, and then whichever of them proved himself to be the best leader would be the one to succeed as the next sultan. So there was an idea of having many sons. They would all have different mothers. A concubine would bear one child, and then she would be responsible for the upkeep and sort of the promotion of that child. Her future depended on how well that child did. That was the tradition. Princesses were also welcome. The Sultan, having all these concubines, had plenty of children. So some of them being girls was just fine because they could be used for advantageous marriages. And so again, they were a tool in the Sultan's hand, maybe the way of resolving a conflict or gaining some additional land. These daughters of his were also very valuable. So the concubines who were able to bear the Sultan a child really got a name for themselves in that way. And once that happened, once she became pregnant, then the focus for that woman, that concubine, would be on the child. And another concubine would just come right on in to take her place. So Suleiman already had 4 children, in fact, when he met Roxelana. And when he chose her, that simply meant now this was her opportunity to sort of get in the system, provide him a child, and then move on. But she broke that pattern. She took the opportunity to remain with him, to remain at his side and in his bed. And he became, unheard of at the time, he became monogamous. He was committed to her. Even after she bore him a son, he kept her around and she bore him additional children. This was unheard of at the time. And in fact, there was a dispatch sent, a contemporary dispatch that from a representative of the Genoese Bank. And here's what it said, quote, "This week, there has occurred in this city a most extraordinary event, one absolutely unprecedented in the history of the sultans. The Grand Seigneur Suleiman has taken to himself as his empress a slave woman. There is great talk about the marriage, and none can say what it means." They were just shocked that the Sultan actually married a concubine. This just didn't happen. She was at his side and she was going to stay there. And this disrupted all of the tradition and all of the expectations. And it really shattered this very careful power balance with the other mothers of one child. That now here is Roxelana, who has more children. And she turned the role of concubine, which had always been a temporary position, into wife, which was a permanent one until her death. It was extraordinary. The relationship was not monogamous. She gave birth to 5 children. And again, children were the path to power. Now she has 5 of them. That completely changes the structure of power and the expectations of how women from then on. Now what? Now you've shattered that tradition. What's going to happen next time? So she really does change everything. So let's take a look again at some of these other images. Isn't this great? I think this one starts to show her. She looks like she's taking some power here to me. Once she was established as the Sultan's favorite, she was given the title Haseki, and that meant favorite. Then the Sultan made her a free woman, so she was no longer a slave. And then he made her his wife. So the title Sultan or Sultan was added to her. So she was the Haseki Sultan, which identified her as a member of the dynastic family. She was now considered a member of the dynastic family, despite having been a slave. This was just extraordinary and sort of unheard of. She shattered the expectations. She was the first concubine to marry the Ottoman Sultan, the Ottoman Emperor. She became an empress. She was born a Christian. I mean, all of these things just shattered expectations. So I want you to think about this just a little bit and ask yourself, have you ever heard a similar type of story? And I'm not saying there's any cause and effect, but I do think there are parts of this story that echo within the Tudor court. So a young girl is supposed to know her place and be a mistress and not have any ambitions beyond that. But somehow she captures the heart of the ruler. In the case of the Tudor court, the king. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, the Grand Seigneur. And she takes her place at his side. This generates a lot of anger in the court. People are very resentful. They call her names and they accuse her of using witchcraft or sorcery to trick the monarch, the king, the Sultan, into caring about her and loving her. In other words, I think there's a little bit of the echo or a little bit of the prefiguring of Anne Boleyn, some of Anne Boleyn's story. You see that the response to powerful women who aren't content to just sort of accept the role that they're assigned does cause a similar reaction in the power base in these different empires. And it was disruptive in the Tudor court. It was incredibly disruptive in the Ottoman court. And adding the word Sultan to Hurrem or Roxelana's name just clarified that she was there to stay, in a similar way to Henry VIII when he had Anne Boleyn crowned with the St. Edward's crown. According to the coronation records, that crown is almost always, in fact, always had been, save for the monarch, not the consort. And yet that was used for Anne Boleyn. It was a gesture by Henry VIII, just like it was a gesture by Suleiman to put Roxelana in this position. Now, I have to share with you one of my favorite stories that's told about Roxelana and Gulbehar, also known as Madhivravan, who was an earlier concubine of Suleiman and was the mother of Mustafa, the oldest son of Suleiman. So the concubine, Mahadrivan or Gulabar, had been, of course, with the Sultan and then had moved on with her son. She did still have contact some with the Sultan and with Roxelana. And you might imagine that Roxelana's step of marrying the Sultan and remaining at his side and giving him more children gave her, Roxelana, quite a higher position than Mustafa's mother had, even though Mustafa was the oldest son. And so apparently one time there was a huge argument between the two women, And Gulbehar called Roxelana sold meat, which was a terrible insult, and actually physically attacked her and scratched her face. And so, not too long later, the Sultan called for Roxelana to come to him, and she took advantage of the situation. She made it work to her benefit. And she said she was too ashamed to come before him because, in her disfigured state, she would not please him. And that just made her too ashamed to come before him. And that was how she told the Sultan about what had happened. And the Sultan was so angry that he sent Gulbahar away, and only Roxelana was allowed to stay. So she did use that to her advantage. And that was one of the ways she was able to use her proximity to the Sultan, to the power making, the decisions at court, to accomplish things that would promote herself and her children and allow her to have an impact. Another way she was able to have an impact was through her building programs. Now, typically, only the Sultan is allowed to embark on grand building programs in the large cities, and especially in Istanbul. But because of her status, Roxelana was able to do what other concubines were not. Another thing she was able to do, which was have these building programs right in Istanbul. And we see this, the Haseki complex, which still stands. Of course, it's been modified some, but it still stands. This is an example of how she demonstrated her position within the royal family in lasting and very visible ways. This was a project in the Aksari district, which was also known at that time as the Women's Bazaar. And her project included a mosque, a college, an inn or hospice, a school for children, and a hospital. And this was the first building project of the new chief royal architect. And so she was allowed to use the skills of the brand new royal architect. And it was at the time the third largest building in Istanbul. So, with all of the sultans through time who'd built things, this woman came along and built this huge complex that enabled her to demonstrate her compassion, that made a physical mark on the land. She did charitable work through this project and through others. She also built public kitchens that acted as like a soup kitchen might today to help religious pilgrims and help the poor and the sick. And so she demonstrated in all kinds of ways her charitable work, but she was able to do so on a scale that had previously not been available to women, especially concubines. And here she was, now the wife of the Sultan, and able to do these large and lasting projects, and able to really make an impact physically on the country and on the people that she led. So Roxelana really made several incredibly significant historical legacies. There are just a lot of things that she was able to accomplish. And as one historian, the wonderful Leslie Pierce, put it, Roxelana, quote, and I'm going to quote this because I love the way she puts it, transformed the imperial harem from a residence for women of the dynasty into an institution that wielded political influence. So Roxelana really changed the way things were done. And so let's take a look at an image, sort of when we think of her legacy. This is her tomb and the lasting legacy she left. The Venetian ambassador said about her, quote, "There has not been in the Ottoman house a lady that has had more authority than Roxelana." And so her authority was known, of course, in the Ottoman Empire, but also throughout Europe by the words of these ambassadors. She also, the Pope was told about her, and we know that some of these ambassadors were writing to the Pope as well. And so he knew about the influence this woman was having. She wanted to have a say in the politics of her country, and we do see her being active in foreign relations. And she promoted friendly relationships between the Ottoman Empire and Poland. Of course, Poland, again, the king of Poland was in control of the area where we believe she was born. And Roxelana is sometimes associated with the treaties that were struck at this time between the Ottoman Empire and Poland, and helped give the Polish leverage in returning some of the slaves that had been captured. And although there's no direct evidence of Roxelana playing a clear, specific role in helping some of the slaves perhaps return, the Polish ambassador credited her with helping protect Polish lands. And there is a folk song that celebrates her as someone who was taken into the Turkish harem and through her influence, quote from the song, set the captives free. And so there is some reason to think that in addition to the work she did right at home, her home, the Ottoman Empire, the buildings she created and the charitable work she did right there, which is so evident, that there may very well have been some extra, some extended influence, that she may well have played a part. She really seems to have. There are some lasting letters between her and the King of Poland that are very friendly. And it's certainly not impossible to believe that her concern for some of these captives, having been one herself, would have made also a lasting difference. So I just want to end. Roxelana, interestingly enough, died in 1558, which is, of course, the year that Elizabeth I comes to the throne. And I do see some similarities between these two extraordinary women. They defied the expectations of what women were supposed to do. They carved their own paths. They made mistakes. They got things wrong, and sometimes they got things really right. They demanded power and authority and reimagined the world, both of these women, with themselves at the center. So thank you so much for joining me to talk about this amazing woman, Roxelana, or the Hurrem Sultan, who became the wife and the empress, who wielded power at a time that was so unusual for women, who upended expectations and rewrote the rule book about how women, concubines, and others were to behave. And in doing so, created a new way for us to see women in the 16th century. Again, thank you for joining me. And I want to thank Natalie once again for allowing me to be part of this wonderful project. Thank you so much.